The railcar doors clanged open at Kummersdorf proving ground, the cold of a Brandenburg morning spilling across steel tracks and stiff uniforms. Crates came first, then 2 trophies, Soviet 34s captured near Smolensk. They were streaked with mud, the color of raw iron, and bore scars from where German anti-tank guns had tried to reason with them and failed. The men of Wa Prüf, sechs, the German Army Weapons Testing Office's armored vehicle department, gathered like surgeons before a body they did not yet understand. Major Heinrich Rabe, an engineer whose standards were as sharp as the calipers in his coat pocket, folded his gloved hands and frowned. "This," he muttered, "is the barbarians' answer to our panther dreams." He meant it as insult. It would become prophecy. When they hauled the first turret off with a gantry crane, snow gusted in through the open bay doors. Welding beads as thick as a man's finger snaked across the armor seams, ugly, uneven, almost careless. To the German eye, trained on the clean interlocks and fine machining of the Panzer III and Panzer IV, this looked like a blacksmith's joke. Oberingenieur Paulus, the same officer who once lectured 5 hours on the merits of precisely ground gear teeth, ran a finger over the crude line and hissed. "It looks," he said slowly, "as if it were welded by farmers." A mechanic nearby, a veteran of the Polish and French campaigns, chuckled. "Farmers who have crushed our guns and outrun our trucks, Herr Oberingenieur." Silence met that comment. Truth, spoken aloud, echoed strangely in concrete halls. The autopsy began with measuring tools and suspicion. Armor plates were thick, yes, as advertised 55 millimeters on the sloped glacis, but the sloping made it behave like much more. What startled them was not only the angle, but the ease of the joining. Big plates, simple joints, welded hurriedly but holding firm, no interlocking. Tongues, no painstaking milling. A foreman whispered that such armor seams could be taught to new welders in days, not years. Inside, the transmission looked like something a farm workshop might have welded together. The clutch was rugged, imprecise, brutal. The gearbox had wide tolerances. A German specialist spun a gear in his hand and shook his head. "These teeth are not finely cut. They are chewed. And yet they work," Rabe said. He sounded like a man forced to praise a mongrel dog for catching rabbits better than his prize hound. The engine bay held the greatest insult of all and the greatest revelation. A V12 diesel. Cast iron block, simplified fuel injection, big coarse filters. A system that could drink low-grade fuel and still drag 30 tons of steel through Russian mud. "This is not engineering," Paulus spat. "It is bludgeoning." But the stopwatch did not lie. Components were removed in minutes that would take German mechanics an hour. Everything was accessible. Fasteners were few. Parts were interchangeable, standardized as though someone had decided war would punish any indulgence in elegance. When they removed a suspension arm, the Christie spring unfurled like a steel serpent. Coarse? Yes, but strong. Easy to build. Easy to replace. Capable of enormous travel over frozen earth and liquid mud. "Why so much deflection?" one engineer asked. A front-line officer, who had seen these tanks move through terrain that stalled half-tracks, gave the answer, "Because Russia is not France." On day 3, they laid parts on the shop floor in neat grids. Engine components here, gear train there, turret assemblies along the wall. They counted welds, they counted bolts, they counted machining steps. And slowly the insult turned into something darker fear disguised as respect. Panzer transmissions required tolerances measured in microns. Soviet tolerances could be measured by sight and touch. German armor plate needed skilled machining before fitting. Soviets just cut and welded. Time. That was the enemy in every calculation. Major Rabe traced a weld seam with a pencil and wrote a note. "This joint saves approximately 30 manufacturing hours compared to German method." Another. "Casting turret components reduces machining by 50%. Another. "Suspension simpler by order of magnitude." A junior draftsman whispered what they were all thinking. "This tank is ugly because ugly is faster." No one laughed. For a decade, German designers pursued perfection, finely balanced engines, interleaved road wheels, precision-milled components, and armor, as much sculpture as steel. They built tanks as if they were building pocket watches. The Soviets built hammers. At a side table, a young engineer compared blueprints. His pencil scratched furiously, his breath fogged in the cold. "We have built for perfection," he said quietly. "They have built for war." His superior clapped him on the shoulder, heavy and paternal. Germany needs no lessons from peasants. Yet every bolt on the floor offered a rebuttal. Calipers clicked. Stopwatches started and stopped. Clipboards filled with reluctant numbers. Removing a 34's transmission, 20 minutes. Removing a Panzer IV's, nearly an hour. Replacing a road wheel, 10 minutes. Replacing interleaved German wheels under field mud conditions, potentially hours. Weld training requirement for Soviet seam, weeks. Training requirement for German armor interlocks, years. A Soviet part might fit sloppily, but it fit. A German part fit perfectly unless mud, ice, or field damage interfered, in which case perfection became fragility. By early December, reports were drafted, findings catalogued, opinions gnawed at pride. One memo, unsigned, circulated quietly. "The enemy has applied mass production philosophy to armored warfare. Our standards of precision, while admirable, may become our defeat." Someone added a handwritten note beneath, "Beauty does not advance across steppe." Another engineer wrote in the margin, "Function is beauty." The phrase made its way through the office like contraband poetry. In the final briefing, engineers spoke in careful tones. Official language was used. But truth seeped through like thawed snow beneath a door. The 34 was not elegant. It did not whisper of craftsmen with magnifying lenses and steady hands. It shouted of factories that worked by floodlight and winter breath. It smelled of oil and urgency. And it worked. When the meeting ended, a single sentence remained on the chalkboard, left by an anonymous hand. "They build to win. We build to admire." Beneath it, someone had scrawled in chalk, "War does not award style points." No one erased it. They brought 2 ledgers to the long table at Kummersdorf, one bound in green cloth, the other in grey card. The green ledger was a hymn book to German craft, finely drawn parts lists for Panzer transmissions, tolerances annotated in neat script, columns of inspection stamps like medals pinned to a parade tunic. The grey ledger, translated from captured Soviet factory notes, was blunt as a hammer. Steel grades, plate sizes, weld lengths, furnace times, and, scrawled in pencil, the only statistic that mattered, output per shift. Major Rabe tapped the green ledger. "This," he said, "is how we make a watch." He tapped the grey. "This is how you make a fist." The discussion that followed was not a quarrel over taste. It was arithmetic, and arithmetic has no loyalty. The Germans began with what they knew best: parts, counts. A Panzer IV turret ring assembly, with its labyrinth of rollers and races, demanded dozens upon dozens of machined pieces, each finished to tight tolerances. The 34 ring, by contrast, was a simplified bearing track, crudely finished, with rollers that would have made a German inspector wince. Yet, the Soviet ring turned, and it turned under shockloads and filth that would have seized a more delicate race. A draftsman laid the numbers out in words. Delete a labyrinth seal, you delete an inspection. Delete an inspection, you delete a queue. Delete a queue, you save a day. He underlined the last clause twice. In winter, a day is a front. Gear trains told the same story. German practice preferred narrow backlash, quiet mesh, case-hardened teeth shaped with loving geometry. Soviet gears were broad, coarsely finished, loud, and almost cheerful in their indifference to elegance. But the Soviet gear did not wait for a master grinder. It left the press, kissed the cutter, met a file, and met the tank. "Minutes," said Oberingenieur Paulus, softer now, "are more tyrannical than millimeters." He had spent years shaving microns from fits. Now he watched a foreman add up minutes with the pitiless calm of a quartermaster calculating bread. A heat treat cycle in a German shop was a ballet. Carefully timed ramp, soak, quench, temper, inspect, stamp. The Soviet notes prescribed furnace up, hold until color, quench in oil if available, and water if not, temper by load, and move on. Was it cruder? Yes. Did it yield uniform hardness? No. Did it crack fewer parts than the calendar cracked divisions? Yes. Welds rendered the same verdict. German interlocked plates demanded planers, mills, and skilled fitters. The weld was the last ribbon on a gift already expensive. Soviet seams were the gift. Sloped plates cut to large patterns met at angles that required no tongues, only courage and current. The bead, thick and wandering, eliminated layers of precision upstream. A weld may be ugly. A weld that holds is beautiful to a clock that measures days and not decades. Look at their fixtures, a visiting factory man said, pointing at photographs from Nizhny Tagil. Open tables, chunky locators, clamps that tolerated frost-stiff gloves and clumsy hands. Our jigs require men with soft touch and clean boots. Theirs invite anyone who can pull a lever. That sentence frightened the room more than any report of armor thickness. If a machine tool insists upon artistry, it will starve in a land that has evacuated its artists. If the fixture forgives, it multiplies hands. German shops parceled work across many specialists. Soviet lines swallowed tasks into combinations. Wiring looms arrived as 2 or 3 sub-assemblies that snapped into place rather than a dozen delicately routed runs. Fastener families were ruthlessly pruned, fewer sizes, coarser threads, bigger heads. A Soviet wrench did not hunt, it found. The green ledger revealed an empire of suppliers, bearings from one town, gears from another, springs from a third, seals from a fourth, a marvel in peacetime, a millstone when bridges fall and locomotives freeze. The grey ledger admitted no romance. If bearing shipment late, one line read, use bronze bushing per drawing B. If bronze late, use wooden block temporary for rail transport. Replace at depot. Paulus rubbed his temple. Wood, he whispered, as if the word itself were an obscenity. But the note's logic was merciless. A wooden block that kept a hull moving to the front was more warlike than a perfect bearing waiting in a shelled rail yard. Castings became the Soviet accent. Where Germans machined from forgings or plate, Soviets poured mass into shape. A cast nose piece, a cast turret, even cast housings for components that would scandalize a German designer. Casting shifted labor from scarce skilled machinists to furnaces, molds, and grinders wielded by anyone who could be trained by noon. Cast surfaces hid roughness under paint. Cores hid ribs the milling machine would have needed days to reveal. Casting tolerates interruption, the factory man said. You can pour at night, quench in the morning, grind at lunch, and no one piece requires a master's full attention. Machining demands a narrative without breaks. War loves interruptions. On the wall they pinned charts hand-drawn from reports. Soviet output rising after the factories jumped the Urals. German curves flattening as bombers found bearings. The Soviet line did not impress for elegance. It impressed by slope. Each simplification, a deleted fastener, a rolled plate in place of 2, a casting instead of a weldment, bent the line upward. Each bend meant more hulls, and hulls are votes in a language artillery understands. An accountant who had watched divisions vanish behind arithmetic coughed and summarized, a design is not a shape, a design is a rate. Someone pinned a sketch of the new German project, the big cat that would prowl the steppe. The silhouette owed a debt to the 34's sloped grace, but the undercarriage revealed old loyalties, interleaved wheels, delicate final drives that would sing when new and scream when starved. The room did not need prophecy to see the paradox. You could borrow a slope, you could not borrow a philosophy without divorcing your pride. We will take their angle, a colonel said. We will not take their indifference. It is not indifference, murmured Rabe. It is discipline of another kind. They ended with a single sheet everyone could understand: man-hours. Replace interlocked joints with straight bevels and welds. Dozens of hours saved per hull. Replace a machined turret with a casting. Dozens more. Standardize fasteners across sub-assemblies. Inspection hours cut. Rework hours cut. Training hours cut. Choose a diesel that tolerates dirt and the wrong fuel. Workshop hours spared at the front, which is the only place hours really count. Nails in a box, minutes in a day, hulls in a week. Sums that defeat adjectives. When the meeting adjourned, the green ledger went back to its shelf, faithful as a family Bible. The grey ledger stayed open beneath the lamp, its pencil lines smudged by many hands. Out, in, the yard, a captured 34 squatted on its broad tracks as snow began again, indifferent to style, built to wait, built to move, and, worst of all to men who loved perfection, built to be made by the thousand, while winter had not yet finished counting. Understood here is the next chapter, to 900 words, continuing the same tone, style, and historiographic rigour. The miracle did not begin with steel. It began with trains. In late summer of 1941, as Army Group Center lunged towards Smolensk and Kiev burned in ash-grey columns, the Soviet State Defense Committee issued orders that read like fiction: remove whole industries, evacuate machine tools, uproot skilled workers, load foundries, lathes, presses, stamping rigs, gauges, blueprints, and families, and move them east of the Volga. It was not a retreat, it was transplantation under fire. German officers scanning aerial photos first thought the Soviets were dismantling their factories as sabotage. Only, later, reading intercepted traffic with emotions that mixed disbelief and dread. Did Wehrmacht analysts realize the truth? The factories were not dying, they were migrating. Freight manifests from the autumn of 1941 to spring of 1942 tell the scale. Tens of thousands of wagons, hundreds of trains, weeks of ceaseless motion. Crews shivered beside rails in sleet and freezing fog, watching as machine tools older than their fathers rattled into the night, tarped under camouflage nets. A German quartermaster, reviewing recovered Soviet dispatches, muttered what would become an epitaph for the Eastern gamble. They are not abandoning industry. They are dragging it behind them like a saint drags relics. Chelyabinsk became a fortress not of stone but steel. Tankograd. To the west, Nizhny Tagil swallowed entire production bureaus, design offices, engine lines, hull presses, turret casting foundries. In days when Germany expected capitulation, the Urals hardened. At Kummersdorf, engineers would later trace machining marks on a 34 mantlet and argue about tolerances. In the Urals, workers stood ankle-deep in mud, guiding casting flasks with numb hands, stamping turrets while artillery rumbled somewhere beyond the horizon like distant thunder. There are accounts, one from a woman who was then 16 describing the first night at the new plant. There was no roof, only canvas. Snow came through. We wore 2 shawls. The machines arrived before the beds. We stood on boards to keep from freezing to the ground. Children oiled bearings, teenagers shoveled coke, machinists taught farmers to read gauges. The best welders were often women, hands steady from sewing, bodies wiry from hunger but spirits ironclad. In the German industrial imagination, tanks were forged by master craftsmen. In the Soviet Union, they were forged by whoever showed up alive that morning. Training manuals were rewritten in blunt phrases. If it fits and holds, it is correct. If it cracks, weld thicker. An inspector in Tagil, interviewed after the war, recalled his instruction. If you reject a hull, you reject a month of mother's rations. Approve unless it breaks your wrench or your conscience. German doctrine would have fainted. The Urals did not have the luxury. Factories became schools. Schools became dormitories. Dormitories became barracks. Meals were watery kasha, black bread when flour arrived, tea brewed from pine needles when tea did not arrive. Yet every shift ended the same way. Another hull rolled to the rail spur, another diesel engine coughed to life. design simplification became law. Blueprints for the 34 were revised not for elegance, but productivity. A bolt deleted was a victory. A casting substituted for a weldment was a triumph. Patterns were simplified so a new worker could interpret them without years in a technical school. Welding fixtures were built on timber frames when steel was short. Rivets vanished. Holes were punched instead of milled. Stampings replaced machined brackets. In a German hall of precision, such drawings would have been heresy. Here, they were scripture. Soviet engineers called the philosophy delat prosto chobi, delat monogo, make simple in order to make many. And when an engineer complained a plate fit poorly, his foreman is recorded to have replied, "Better a rough tank in battle than a perfect tank on paper." German officers inspecting destroyed 34s in 1942 noted cracked welds, broken gear teeth, spalled internal armor. They misread these as proof of inferiority. The real question, one the frontline reports whispered, was brutal. How far did it drive before it cracked? If it crossed the Dnieper, lived 2 battles, and killed 3 panzers before an oil seal failed, then metallurgy textbooks became irrelevant. One Soviet factory report captured the essence. Each tank must survive to Stalingrad, not to Berlin. We will build the Berlin tanks later. It was not cynicism, it was scheduling. In 1941, the 34 was a shock. By 1942, it was a flood. By 1943, Berlin analysts began to fear that even if every panzer was invulnerable, mathematics would drown them. German memoranda from late 1942 describe the numbers in tones usually reserved for natural disasters. They relocate their factories and increase output. They replace workers as fast as shells remove them. They build not tanks, but capacity itself. At one conference, a Wehrmacht colonel drew 2 lines on a chalkboard. One rose like a winter sun, one drooped like a wounded arm. He said nothing, he did not need to. Soviet assembly floors in winter looked like trenches with cranes overhead, snow dusted frames, oil stiffened like syrup. Workers blew into gloves between passes with slag hammers, yet the output line climbed. Cranes swung turrets over hulls at midnight, under flood lamps that drew moths and hope alike. A diesel engine coughed youthfully even when the mechanic wiping its manifold looked 70 at age 20. And everywhere, slogans etched in chalk on pillars. Speed is armor, quantity is courage, simplicity is victory. When the first Panther crews examined a 34, they called it crude. When German intelligence examined Soviet production relocation, they called it unbelievable. When the war's midpoint came and output tables arrived on Führer headquarters desks, they called it impossible. In Tankergrad, they simply called it Tuesday. The order came in winter, as many Soviet industrial orders did, blunt as a brick through glass, without apology, without room for nostalgia. More guns. More turrets, fewer steps, same speed. By late 1943, Red Army tank brigades had crushed their way from Stalingrad's bone-white ruins to the vast wheat carcasses of Kursk. In those burned fields, a truth emerged. The W par Rabe 34 had won its duel with the Panzer III and IV, but the battlefield had grown teeth. German long-barreled guns struck farther now. Tigers prowled like iron aristocrats. Panthers stalked hull down, arrogant in their sloped armor, confident in their optics. A Soviet tank planner scribbled the new arithmetic on a blackboard at Nizhny Tagil. We do not need better tanks. We need better killing for the same tank. That equation birthed the 3485, not a revolution, but a sharpening. It was the industrial equivalent of swapping the peasant's axe head and leaving the handle unchanged. In German factories, a new gun meant a redesign cascade. Optics housings changed, balance weights recalculated, recoil gear tolerances reground, crews retrained, manuals rewritten in fussy Gothic script. In Soviet factories, the gun arrived with a note: "Make it fit." The 85mm weapon, with its squat recoil cylinders and breech block thick as a butcher's knuckles, was almost rude in proportion. Yet it slid into a redesigned turret that was not machined like a jewel, but cast like a pot. Large moulds, coarse sand, thick walls, geometry chosen so molten steel could flow without voids, even if the foundry worker was frozen, exhausted, or 16 years old. The turret ring grew. The turret sprouted a third crewman commander freed from loading duty. The optics improved not Zeiss clarity, but enough clarity to find a grey shape on a white horizon and shoot it before it shot back. And everywhere, the doctrine remained: add power without adding labour. German observers saw the new turret and sneered at its texture, rough as tree bark, pitted like winter skin. But under that roughness lived something Germany could never replicate: cycle time advantage. A German turret required milling stations, finishing passes, tool changes, men who could twirl micrometers like fountain pens. A 34-85 turret required scrap melted, poured, and chipped free of sand. A grinder kissed it, not a master machinist. "You cannot destroy a process like this with bombs," a Soviet foreman said in a 1944 meeting, tapping a cast turret with a hammer. "You would have to kill the earth." The design bureau's internal memos read like battlefield commandments: 1 wrench size per crew station, 1 latch, not 2. 1 hinge if possible, pins if hinges break. Electrical systems were reloomed so that looms dropped into hulls in a single lift. Periscopes standardized to one form, seats bolted instead of riveted. Ammunition racks simplified into steel hoops welded direct to hull ribs. The gun cradle used slab plates instead of milled castings when the foundry was overloaded. A German inspector would have called these decisions vulgar. A Soviet production chief called them survival. A debate between two engineers in Tagil is preserved in post-war notes. One argued for a more refined turret, basket, smoother floor ring bearings, radios with greater clarity. The other pointed at casualty reports from Kursk and said, quietly, "Comrade, every hour we polish steel, a platoon dies waiting for steel to arrive." The first engineer fell silent. In that war, mathematics enforced humility more ruthlessly than any commissar. German tank crew manuals resembled university texts, diagrams, torque specs, joint angles, lubrication charts. Beautiful, fragile, slow. The new 3485 crew booklet was so short it bordered on insulting. How to use the periscope, how to clear the breach, where the wrench lived, how to drain the radiator in deep frost, how to drive, not gracefully, but forward. And taped inside many turrets, no romance here, a 3-line chart: 3 rounds, 10 seconds, 1 enemy corpse of steel. Tank crews trained on derelicts, dragged from snowbanks, engines sputtering, clutches scraped to metal. Then they climbed into new tanks, nodded, once, and rolled east. Veterans trained recruits with gloves still stiff from cordite. Germany trained specialists. The Soviet Union trained operators. Operators multiply. Specialists die. When German analysts first examined the 85's breech block, they noted its surface finish, uneven. They scoffed until they timed field stripping. A Soviet loader could clear a jam or swap a firing pin in seconds. Parts were oversized where stress demanded and simply big enough elsewhere. Nothing required a jeweler's touch. Tools were blunt, clearances humane. One Wehrmacht technical memo, never meant for propaganda, recorded the shock. Machine tolerances extremely coarse, yet reliability high. Indicates design intentionally accepts imprecision to speed manufacture. Impossible to replicate without abandoning German practice. That last line was prophecy disguised as shame. By mid-1944, German industry tried to respond. Panthers rolled, tigers growled. The workshops swore at final drives that cracked like glass under stress. Meanwhile, in the Urals, tanks rolled off lines like loaves from an oven. The 85 gun mounts arrived on carts. Turrets dropped with a crane swing. 3 bolts, 2 weld beads, test fire, paint, rail. A worker, asked why he sanded only the forward glacis, answered, "That is the part Fritz sees first. Everything else stayed raw. Raw metal kills just as dead." By the time the Red Army surged across Poland, the Germans no longer laughed at Soviet welds. They feared them. They feared the way turrets looked like they had been bitten from steel by an animal, not machined by a man. They feared the roar of a diesel fed by fuel a tractor could drink. They feared the army that built not tanks, but momentum. The 34-85 was not perfect. Crews still suffered. Optics lagged behind German glass. Radios sometimes crackled like campfires instead of speaking. But when a Soviet commander stood on a frozen embankment and watched a battalion of the new tanks pass like an iron river, he understood something deeper than engineering. Perfection is a luxury for nations who face only peace. Victory belongs to those who build enough fast enough to bury perfection. In the Urals they did not carve steel, they poured will, and will, multiplied by foundries, becomes destiny. The Panther, when it first stalked from German assembly halls in mid-1943, looked like an apology carved in steel, a belated admission that the 34 had rewritten tank geometry. Sloped armor, long-barreled gun with predatory reach, wide tracks, a silhouette that could have been traced from a Soviet blueprint held against a candle. Yet a paradox sat in every welded seam and polished bearing. Germany had copied the shape of Soviet pragmatism, but kept the soul of German perfection. It was as if a watchmaker had been shown a hammer and, in trying to imitate it, inlaid the hammer with jewels. Where the 34 spoke in blows, the Panther whispered intolerances. German officers who had inspected early 34s outside Moscow in late 1941 had filed reports with tones normally reserved for disasters. Enemy armor, superior in form, weight distribution, and slope. Immediate counter required, but industry moved with arrogance born of peacetime habits. Engineers quarreled over whether a 65mm plate sloped was truly superior to an 80mm plate upright. Metallurgists debated alloys, while frontline crews asked a simpler question: why do they have a diesel that starts in winter, and we do not? When the Panther design finally solidified, it carried within it the tension of a nation that wanted to modernize without surrendering pride. The sloped armor was Soviet in spirit, the everything else was German. The Panther's road wheels were a marvel interleaved discs like a clockmaker's fantasy, designed to spread weight and smooth ride. They gave the tank a cat-like glide on firm ground. In a field manual, it looked like genius. In Russia, in thaw season, it looked like madness. Mud froze between wheels, then thawed, then froze again. Crews smashed ice with pry bars while artillery rumbled in the distance. A 34 crew could pull a track with crowbars and profanity. A Panther crew sometimes needed a workshop and prayers. One Soviet commander said it best when interrogated after the war. "We feared the Panther's gun, we pitied the Panther's mechanic." Inside the Panther's transmission lay the true difference between the two philosophies. The 34 used a gear system that a farmhand could bully into cooperation with boots and grease. The Panther used a transmission that could have served in a parade limousine synchronizers, fine-cut gears, surfaces polished like mirror metal. It shifted like silk when it shifted at all. Under battlefield loads, that delicacy became a liability. Field reports read like the autopsy of a thoroughbred racehorse forced to pull plows. Gears sheared under stress. Bearings failed when starved of oil. Repair time excessive. Tooling inadequate at field echelons. The Panther was meant to glide. War forced it to grind. German production chiefs tried to accelerate Panther assembly. But complexity is tyrannical. Each Panther was a cathedral of machined surfaces, each requiring master hands. You do not rush cathedrals, you suffer them. At Nizhny Tagil, a 34 hull could be welded by a 19-year-old farm girl taught the trade in 1 week. At MAN Augsburg, a Panther hull joint demanded craftsmen who had apprenticed for years men now dying at Kursk or freezing near Vitebsk. Blueprints did not lie. The Panther required thousands more man-hours than a 34. It needed supplies from dozens of specialized firms scattered across a continent being pounded by bombers. The 34 needed a furnace, sheet, steel, castings, and will. A Soviet engineer, shown a Panther captured outside Kovel, ran a hand along its road wheel bogies and laughed, "We build tanks to win the war. They build tanks to win prizes." On paper, the Panther outgunned and out-armored most Allied tanks. Its 75mm high-velocity gun could slice a 34 nose-on at range. Its frontal slope shrugged off many shells. Against a single target on an open field, it was magnificent. But war is rarely a duel. War is logistics, range, uptime, and repetition. War is not the quality of one tank on Tuesday, but the presence of many tanks on Thursday. A German officer watching a Panther battalion muster wrote in a private letter, "They are lions, but lions need meat. We can no longer feed them. Fuel shortages strangled mobility. Spare parts shortages immobilized half the fleet. Experienced mechanics were dead or in hospitals. Workshops lacked cranes. Trains lacked steel rails not bombed from existence." Soviet crews learned the Panther's lessons in the fields outside Prokhorovka. They feared its gun. They respected its armor. But they noticed something else. When a Panther broke, it stayed broken long enough to map its grave with artillery. A Soviet after-action report from 1944 said it plainly, "Better to fight one Panther than 3 34s. A tank that cannot be made quickly is a medal, not a weapon. A weapon is defined by its ability to appear again and again and again, even when the world is on fire." Germany had glimpsed the 34's gospel: simplicity, slope, speed. Yet pride bent the lesson. They imitated form without respecting function. They built a Soviet silhouette around a German heart, precise, delicate, unforgiving. The Panther killed many tanks. The 34 killed an economy. By 1945, the Panther had become a symbol, gorgeous, lethal, tragic, a blade sharper than the handle that held it. The 34 was a hammer. A battlefield does not need one perfect cut, it needs many blows. One German engineer, interviewed in 1950, summed it with bitterness and awe. "We engineered the ideal machine for a world that no longer existed. They engineered the ideal machine for the world that did." In blueprints, the Panther was superior. In mud, in snow, in factory yards filled with teenagers and widows, in rails crawling east, in numbers pulled like teeth from steel, the 34 won. Not because it was elegant, but because it could be built by a nation at war, not a nation at peace. Frontline truth arrives not in laboratory reports, but in mud, in oil-soaked snow, in the choking fumes of a frozen dawn, when an engine refuses to turn, and a mechanic stares at the sky like a condemned man. It arrives when a crewman's gloves are too stiff to undo a fine-threaded bolt, when a wrench slips because the nut is milled to a jeweler's standard instead of a soldier's need. It arrives when ideal engineering meets a world that has stopped caring about ideals. On the Eastern Front, good enough proved deadlier than perfect. In German motor pools from Smolensk to Kharkov, maintenance logs swelled with furious handwriting. Fine tolerances, so prized in Stuttgart and Kassel, turned spiteful at -30 degrees. Gearboxes froze like wounded joints. Precision bearings seized when dust baked into glue. A Panther transmission might run like silk in Bavaria. In Kursk, it whimpered. In Soviet workshops, often nothing more than canvas roofs and wood plank bays sunk in permafrost, men in sheepskin coats tightened bolts with sleeves when wrenches were scarce. They hammered frozen link pins with rifle butts. They started engines with bonfires lit under the oil pan. And the 34 woke. Not gracefully, not politely, but it woke. A German lieutenant wrote in winter 1943, "We treat our tanks as machines. They treat theirs as livestock. They kick, curse, and whip them into life, and they move. Ours sit like opera singers refusing to perform in the cold." In German doctrine, maintenance was a profession. Crews operated, specialists repaired, manuals were volumes, tools were labelled and sorted like surgical instruments. In Soviet doctrine, maintenance was survival. Every crewman was a mechanic by necessity. Manuals fit on a page. Tools were whatever fit your hand. A pry bar and a hammer solved problems that German workshops addressed with torque tables and dial indicators. Soviet tankers joked bitterly and proudly. If you can fix a plow, you can fix a 34. If you need a watchmaker, you are already dead. A 34 engine could be pulled with a tripod of logs and rope. A Panther's power pack demanded cranes. A Tiger's gearbox demanded prayers. One Wehrmacht maintenance NCO recorded at Vitebsk, "The Russians change engines like socks. We change transmissions like funeral rites, slowly, expensively, and with mourning. Every soldier learns to hate mud." But the Eastern Front mud was mythological, a substance halfway between tar and sea, crawling into bearings, swallowing tools, freezing around wheels like armor forged by winter. The 34's wide tracks rode the mud like snowshoes. Its Christie suspension, coarse, agricultural, almost rude in stroke, seemed designed by a farmer, not an engineer. It bounced. It lurched. It shook, teeth loose. It moved. German tanks with interleaved wheels, the Panther's pride clogged. Mud packed between wheels like concrete. Crews used saws to cut it out. One panzer regiment reported that 1 in 3 breakdowns during thaw season were due to frozen muck alone. Those numbers were buried in reports with censored margins, but commanders whispered them like curses. A Soviet mechanic, interviewed after the war, shrugged. "Mud is a soldier like us. It helps those who respect it." The 34's engine block tolerated dust like a desert mule. Its filters were crude but abundant. Its fuel pump could drink mixtures a German manual would condemn. Its clutch could be field rebuilt with files and curses. Armor plates, if cracked, could be gouged and re-welded in hours. Crews patched holes with scrap steel cut from burned tanks. German tanks required spares from Germany. Soviet tanks sometimes made their own spares from wreckage. A Red Army report from late 1943 noted, "Do not tow a disabled tank backward, the Germans will repair it. Burn it and take its bones." Bones meant road wheels, track pins, vision blocks, periscopes, tools. The battlefield itself became a supply chain. Yes, German optics were superb. Zeiss glass could find a commander's head at 1,000 meters, reticles etched with precision, range-finding by calculation. Soviet optics were simpler, less clarity, less range. But while German gunners adjusted dials, Soviet gunners bracketed. One shot to see, the second to kill. They fired faster because they didn't treat each round like a duel. A 34 gunner wrote in 1942, "I do not need to see his buttons. I need to see his death." German tanks burned less often when hit in theory. In practice, maintenance issues, brittle fuel lines, and ammunition racks packed tightly by crews terrified of shortage made many Panther and Tiger crews face the same orange fate as their enemies. Meanwhile, the 34's diesel engine, that simple growling slab, shrugged off sparks and spall with stubborn indifference. Diesel does not explode like gasoline. A Soviet tanker, pulling comrades from a burning vehicle, muttered through black smoke, "We burn, but slower than they do." Sometimes slower is victory. On paper, German design retained superiority in engineering grace. In fields, Soviet design achieved superiority in operational life. A German officer, after Kursk, summarized the frontline verdict without romance. "The 34 is not a tank. It is a compromise that kills us." A Soviet commissar put it differently in a speech at Nizhny Tagil. "A perfect tank arrives late. A good tank arrives now. Victory arrives with the tank that arrives." By 1944, the Eastern Front was not a clash of armor theories, it was a race between breakdowns. The side whose tanks restarted on frozen mornings advanced. The side whose tanks waited for spares retreated. A German mechanic, captured near Minsk with oil on his coat and defeat in his eyes, said to his Soviet interrogator, "You fought with iron. We fought with silver. Iron wins wars. The interrogator, a man with a wrench in his belt and grease on his sleeves, answered, No, simple iron wins wars. And in the mud, under the snow, beside engines steaming like war horses, both men understood they were speaking of the same truth. Wars are not decided only by bullets and bravery, but by ledgers. Not the elegant kind kept in officer clubs, but the grease-smudged notebooks on factory floors, the oil-blotted ration sheets pinned to commissar boards, the production reports that arrive at headquarters like blood counts in a failing patient. The Eastern Front was a war of arithmetic. In that arithmetic, simplicity became the deadliest algorithm when German General Staff began comparing figures on tank output in late 1942. They did not gasp at the numbers, they suffocated on them. One German Panther consumed thousands of man-hours, tens of thousands of precision tool passes, hundreds of bearings that needed polishing like surgeons' instruments. Its assembly required trained machinists who already lay beneath Russian earth. Meanwhile, in the Urals, a 34 consumed less. It drank crude labor. It feasted on repetition. It thrived on uniform bolts, simple weld beads, forgings that looked rough enough to insult a German inspector. A German quartermaster's report written in Tarnów in early 1943 captured the shock in numbers disguised as lament. A 34 requires roughly one-third the labor of a panzer. Our nation builds excellence. Our enemy builds inevitability. The man meant it as warning. History recorded it as epitaph. At Nizhny Tagil, production planners did not think in pride or precision. They thought in hours. Hours were bullets. Hours were brigades. 134 required hundreds of man-hours fewer than the year prior. This was not luck. It was ideological discipline applied to wrench and mold. When one bolt could be eliminated, it disappeared. When two weld seams could be replaced with one casting, the foundry poured it. When a bracket needed machining, they redesigned it to bend. And when confronted with the fact German tanks had smoother armor edges, a Soviet foreman spat tobacco into snow and answered, "Smooth edges do not reach Berlin faster." Industrial historians like to speak of ramp-up curves. In the Soviet Union, ramp-up was not a curve. It was a cliff, climbed with bare hands. In 1941, when the shadow of Operation Barbarossa fell across factory walls, the Soviet state wrenched entire industries onto rails. Machine shops, furnaces, even half-assembled tanks rode east into cold fog. Children carried cutting oil, old men carried blueprints, women carried engines like they were infants. The Germans saw retreat. History saw relocation of victory. By 1943, Tagil alone rolled tanks as if reality itself respected Soviet production schedules. Trains arrived, coal dumped. Steel poured. Tanks berthed in hours, not days. One engineer recalled, "We did not start shifts. We only paused to bury the dead and oil the presses." German economic memoranda from 1943 read like confessions. Their tanks cost fortunes in Reichsmarks, even as Reichsmarks lost meaning. A Panther's budget could field several 34s. A Tiger's cost could birth an entire tank company in the Urals. Worse, every repair on a German tank fed a hungry chain of subcontractors. Every gear tooth replaced meant a workshop in Saxony, a supply officer in Prague, a fuel line from Romania, and a train vulnerable to bombs over the Ruhr. A 34 repair needed torch, hammer, scavenged plate, and will. Numbers poisoned German nerves. Soviet reports looked like hymns of blunt efficiency. One Soviet accounting sheet bore a line in red ink: cost per tank decreasing, cost per enemy increasing. Post-war myth sometimes imagines the battlefield as an arena of equals. A Tiger facing a 34 in a duel, one shell, one shot, smoke curling like fate. Reality was uglier and simpler. A Tiger replaced in months faced a 34 replaced tomorrow. German tank brigades limped forward with engines coughing. Soviet brigades absorbed losses before lunch and attacked again by dusk. Quantity did, not overwhelm quality. Quantity created its own quality, the quality of presence. Presence is a weapon, absence is defeat. A Soviet economist at a post-war symposium in 1948 told a story. During the hardest winter, his desk neighbor at Uralvagonzavod kept a list, not of quotas, not of rubles, a list of funerals. Workers froze, collapsed, burned, crushed under cranes. The line did not halt. Their names became lines in a ledger that ended with one sentence. We pay iron with blood. The enemy pays blood with iron. We have more blood and more iron. Cold, yes. Cruel, yes. But in war, truth rarely dresses pretty. German accountants asked how to optimize unit cost without sacrificing workmanship. Soviet commissars asked only one question: how do we build more? If a factory delivered 10% more tanks with 30% uglier welds, it was rewarded. If a German factory delivered welds 10% smoother and output 5% slower, it was admired and strangled by consequence. Perfection was treason by delay. Production was patriotism in steel. A captured German staff officer whispered in 1944 interrogation, "We lost the war when we believed a tank was a jewel. You believed a tank was a nail. Nails win wars." By late 1944, the Red Army did not just have tanks, it had momentum as inventory, and momentum is a number no enemy ledger can erase. On the steppe, across rivers, smashing across Poland, rolling through Prussia columns stretched like metal rivers. German scouts measured not tank models but tank masses. Reports simply read, "too many." Factories did not merely build the 34. The 34 built a nation capable of building more 34s. Germany built tanks. The Soviet Union built capability. Capability wins wars. In a quiet archive long after the war, a Soviet production officer, old and soft-spoken, summarized the truth to a young historian who expected glory tales. The 34 was not our best tank. It was simply the tank we could build, again and again and again, and that is why you are here to ask. Ledgers tell no lies. The numbers chose the victor. The tanks merely delivered the verdict. The guns quieted before the pencils did. Even as Berlin lay in ruins and Soviet banners fluttered over the Reichstag, another battle had begun, one waged in conference rooms, lecture halls, and whispered exchanges between engineers who had survived the cataclysm. They came not in uniforms, but in grey suits and work coats, carrying slide rules and moral weight. The question hanging heavy over post-war Europe was not who had won. That answer smouldered in cities and graves, but why. Germany had designed masterpieces. The Soviet Union had built victory. 1946, a cold morning in Stuttgart. Former German armaments engineers sat across from Allied analysts at a long oak table. Some still wore factory badges from Henschel, Mahn, Daimler-Benz. The walls smelled faintly of cordite and wet plaster, the odor of a nation still drying from ruin. A British colonel placed a crude cast steel 34 sprocket on the table. Its surface looked like baked earth, rough and uneven. A German engineer, once a proud Panther gearbox designer, frowned. "It is primitive." The colonel nodded. Then he placed production ledgers beside it, Soviet, German, American. The German's eyes traced the columns. His voice shrank. "It is genius." In Allied interrogation rooms, German officers repeated variations of the same confession. We believed engineering was art. They believed engineering was arithmetic. German factories sought precision first, output second. Soviet factories reversed the equation. The result was not elegance but availability, and availability is battlefield oxygen. One American ordnance officer tallied it plain. A perfect tank that arrives late is worse than a flawed tank that arrives every morning. The Soviet Union did not worship perfection. It worshipped repeatability. And repeatability is a doctrine as lethal as any doctrine written in blood. In 1948, at a technical symposium in Zurich, former German, American, and Soviet engineers reluctantly shared a stage. One German, formerly of Wa Prüf sechs, stood to present. He spoke of tolerances, of precision machining, of surface polishing that could make a machinist weep with pride. A Soviet engineer interrupted softly. How many tanks did it build? Silence as sharp as shrapnel. The German swallowed and admitted, too few. Later, over tea, that same Soviet engineer, a woman from Chelyabinsk tractor plant, her hands still bearing scars from winter welding, explained the Soviet secret. We simplified until stupid men could not fail and tired women could not make mistakes. We designed for conditions, not dreams. Contrary to myth, Soviet engineers respected Western assistance, but not for reasons the West imagined. Crates stamped with Detroit Arsenal, Ford, Bethlehem Steel had arrived during the war. Inside, Soviet teams found not tools of luxury but production ideas, assembly line fixtures, weld gauges, jigs for repeatable measurements, rivet spacing templates, crude to Americans, revolutionary to a nation building while fleeing. A Soviet plant manager famously said in 1947, "We did not copy American tanks, we copied their willingness to simplify." And when Soviet delegations toured Ford River Rouge post-war, they did not study the cars, they studied the conveyors. Captured German notes from 1945 showed desperation masked as hope. If only we can field 2,000 Panthers. The numbers mocked them. 2,000 was dream. Meanwhile, Soviet planners casually wrote, "Produce 50,000 units." They did not mean 50,000 Panthers. They meant 50,000 anything that drove and shot. A former German production officer, questioned in 1947, sighed. "We tried to build kings. They built citizens." In the Urals, veterans of Uralvagonzavod returned to their peacetime roles. The furnaces cooled, but the doctrine did not. They had learned a lesson that generations of designers never forgot. Build for the factory you have, not the factory you wish existed. A Soviet engineering manual published in 1949 carried a blunt line, red underlined. "The enemy of good is perfect, and perfect loses wars." German post-war reports echoed the realization with painful clarity. One engineer wrote, "We had engineers who could solve any technical problem except the problem of time." Time, that most merciless metric, chose its victor like a judge stamping a verdict on history's desk. Long after the war, in quiet museums and hidden depots, 34s sat with paint peeling, tracks rusting, yet shapes unmistakable. Not beautiful, not refined, but true. A retired Soviet tank commander, interviewed in 1985 in Minsk, tapped one with his cane. "This machine won because we could bury one today and drive two more tomorrow." Then he added the sentence that historians still debate, yet none dare dismiss. "The Germans built machines to impress engineers. We built machines to survive engineers and war." In the end, the 34 taught the most expensive lesson ever paid in lives and steel. A crude tool delivered on time beats a perfect tool delivered too late. Factories win wars before armies ever fight them. Blueprints shape borders more than artillery. Simplicity, multiplied, becomes supremacy. When the final wartime accountants closed their books, they found no poetry between the rows, only arithmetic that roared like a tank engine. Better enough today beats perfect tomorrow. Every single time. The engineers who once sneered at rough welds came to understand a nation that embraces sufficiency can outfight one that worships perfection. And so, in the silent archives and rust-stained workshops where history whispers loudest, one truth remains. The 34 was not the best tank of the war. It was the most built tank of the war, and history remembers the tanks that arrive, not the ones still being machined.